Hello and welcome back. We're continuing with our video lesson for 1.6 Kingdom Plantae, and in this video we're going to learn about the next group, which is Group Pteridophytes. Now, as you can see from this diagram here, it's something that you might be really familiar with, which is what we usually associate with ferns. But Pteridophytes is not just about ferns, so let's have a look at the lesson itself. Before we continue with the content, let's have a look at the learning objectives. So I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to describe the unique characteristics of group pteridophytes and also state the classification of pteridophytes into two phyla, which are phylum Lycophyta and phylum Pteridophyta. If you're ready, let's continue. Okay, so let's talk about the unique characteristics of pteridophytes, which I hope would come into mind when you think an image of these plants. Okay, so let's think about the fern. Which kind of environment would you find ferns in? So that brings us to its first unique characteristic, is that its habitat is most common in damp or moist places, mainly because it is dependent to water for fertilization. Pteridophytes have flagellated sperm cells, and these sperm cells must swim through a film of water in order to reach the egg cell. Pteridophytes are seedless plants, so they do not produce seeds, and they have simple lignified vascular tissues. These vascular tissues, the purpose is to transport water and nutrients or minerals and also provide mechanical support to the plant itself. When we say they have simple lignified vascular tissues, what we mean is they have lignified phloem and xylem. But these vascular tissues are not well developed. So tidaklah secanggih mana. Or we can also say it is a non-complex vascular system. Xylem dengan phloem dia adalah pada bentuk ataupun structure yang agak ringkas. Okay, so those are the four first unique characteristics. Moving on to the next one. Another unique characteristic of pteridophytes is that the dominant generation is sporophyte. So ini terbalik dengan bryophyte yang kita belajar dalam previous subtopic. Okay, so the sporophyte generation of pteridophytes will be large in size and long-lived. Apa yang kamu nampak sebagai paku pakis itu adalah dia punya sporophyte generation yang besar dan hidup lebih lama. The gametophyte generation is small in size and free-living. Dia ada gametophyte generation, cuma jarang kita perasan. Okay? And then, when the gametophyte generation is starting, sometimes you can have not sometimes, memang akan ada young sporophyte tumbuh daripada gametophyte. So when the sporophyte is small and very young, it will be dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. But after a while, the sporophyte will mature and then it will no longer depend on the gametophyte for nutrition because when it is mature, it can carry out its own photosynthesis. Okay, so this is a few diagrams, a few images to show the gametophytes of pteridophytes. In this image here, we have fern gametophytes, which are also sometimes called a prothallus. So they are tiny structures that are often found just below the soil surface or growing right on the soil surface. So kamu nampak ni di agak kecil, ini pun dengan kamera yang sudah zoom in. Okay, it's kind of heart-shaped. You can see the little rhizoids. This is the gametophyte of Dryopteris species, which is a type of fern. See, very small. And in this diagram, we can see that there is a young sporophyte growing out of this gametophyte. So this is the developing sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. This is another one. You see the very young sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. So at this stage, the young sporophyte will depend on the gametophyte for nutrition until it is big enough to do its own photosynthesis. Okay, so that is one unique characteristic of pteridophytes. Another unique characteristic of pteridophytes is that most of them are heterosporous, whereas some are homosporous. And we can divide organisms in group pteridophytes into two types based on their production of spores. Kalau kita tengok dari segi spore saja, bukan phylum-phylum, Okay, kita tengok bentuk rupa spor dia sahaja. Kita boleh bagikan kepada dua kumpulan. Kumpulan pertama homosporous, kumpulan kedua heterosporous. In homosporous pteridophytes, they have only one type of sporangium that produces one type of spore. Examples of organisms in this is Lycopodium species and Dryopteris species. Another type is heterosporous pteridophytes. In heterosporous pteridophytes, it has two types of sporangia that will produce two types of spores. So the spores will either be microspore or megaspore. Dalam erti kata lain, dihasilkan jantan dan betina. So example of heterosporous pteridophyte is Selaginella species. Now let's have a look at this diagram once again. These are the two types of pteridophytes based on their production of spores. If it is homosporous, you will start with the sporangium, which is diploid. The cells in sporangium will divide by meiosis and produce spores, which are haploid. The spores will develop into bisexual gametes. So in one gametophyte, you will have a male part and a female part. The female part of the gametophyte will produce egg cell, okay, female part archegonia, and the male part of the gametophyte is enteridia, which will produce sperm cell. So kalau kamu bayangkan protellus daun kecil yang bentuk love tadi itu, satu bahagian daripada dia akan hasilkan sperm cell, satu bahagian daripada dia akan hasilkan female egg cell. Okay, so that's example of homosporous pteridophytes. If it is heterosporous, this is what will happen. In the megasporangium, it will divide by meiosis to produce megaspore. Megaspore develop into unisexual female gametophyte. Dan gametophyte, satu tumbuhan yang gametophyte itu akan hasilkan archegonia yang akan hasilkan egg cell sahaja. Another part of the plant may produce microsporangium. The microsporangium divide by meiosis to form microspore, which is haploid. Microspore develop into unisexual male gametophyte. This male gametophyte is going to grow and form enteridia, which will produce sperm cells. Okay, so you can see ini adalah bisexual. Ini adalah ada jantan dan betina. Okay, that is it about homosporous and heterosporous pteridophytes. We're going to move on to other unique characteristics of pteridophytes. Since we know that it has a real vascular system, we can also deduce that it has true roots, true stems, and true leaves. So kalau kamu tengok, dia adalah daun sebenar, stem sebenar, dan akar sebenar. Because it is due to the presence of the simple vascular tissues. Only if you have simple vascular tissues, then you can count that as true roots, stems, and leaves. The pteridophytes also have stomata that allow gaseous exchange and transpiration. The sporophyte of pteridophytes will have adventitious roots. So if you look at this diagram of Dryopteris, okay, ini adalah dia punya sporophyte generation of Dryopteris. Kamu tengok akar dia. Akar dia adalah menjalar dan sampai suatu masa dia bergantung kepada condition jugalah. Akar dia boleh hasilkan tunas baru. So adventitious roots means that they can go around and when necessary, they can produce new types of cells. So they can produce tissues that are going to turn into the stem and then into the leaves of the plant. The sporophyte also has a waterproof cuticle. So this will prevent it from drying out in its environment. We're going to move on to the next unique characteristic of pteridophytes, which is in its reproduction. Reproduction in pteridophytes, fertilization is fully dependent on watery medium. Needs water for fertilization because the sperm cells are flagellated and they must swim through a film of water to reach the egg cell. Kalau tiada air, sperm cell dia tidak boleh sampai kepada egg cell. The pteridophytes reproduce sexually by producing spores for dispersion. Okay, so this is another diagram to show you. In this first diagram, we are showing that the reproduction of pteridophytes needs a watery medium. Okay, nampak daripada ni Protalus, ada enteridium, ada archegonium. Sperm cell from the enteridium will swim to the archegonium of another plant. You can see in this diagram, it is showing the true roots, stems, and leaves of Dryopteris. Okay, so this is what the spores of the ferns look like. Kalau kamu pernah tengok daun fern, okay, if you ever grabbed a fern leaf and you look on the underside of the leaf, you will see that there are dots underneath. Okay, kalau kamu, cubalah cari nanti. Kalau jumpa itu pakis-pakis, tengok di bawah dia. Or even under the big bird nest fern, you will see that they are little dots. Ada macam bintik-bintik hitam di bahagian bawah daun tu. Okay, itu bukan kotoran, itu bukan kumbang, itu adalah dia punya spore. If you really zoom in using a microscope, you will see that the little spores actually look like this. And the spores are inside of the sporangia. Sporangia ataupun sporangium adalah organ dia yang akan hasilkan spores. So if you have the chance, go ahead and find some ferns to observe. And we're not just talking about the big ferns, we're also talking about the smaller pteridophytes like Lycopodium species. Now in this slide, it is showing you the leaves of Lycopodium species. The leaves on Lycopodium, you can start to label them as microphyls, okay? Microphyls are the small spine-shaped leaves on pteridophytes like this. And they can also have sporophyls, which are leaves that are modified to bear sporangium. Inside sporangium is the spores. So ini, diagram ini adalah yang di zoom in daripada ini. A strobilus is when you have many sporophylls, you group it together to form like a cone-like structure. Penting kamu hafal apa yang dalam diagram ni, tidak penting mau hafal, tapi selagi kamu ada cuba tengoklah dan cuba macam fahami sikit dia punya bentuk. Tapi tidak perlu hafal untuk bahagian ini. Okay, so if you are blur on this part, don't worry, no problem. We'll just continue on with the next slide. The next slide is looking at another pteridophyte called Selaginella species. Here you can see the microphyls, which is the small leaf, microphyll. And then you can see the strobilus, okay, the cone-like structure. Inside of the strobilus, you would find the megasporangium and microsporangium. Remember, Selaginella species is an example of pteridophyte that is heterosporous. So dia antara pteridophyte yang akan hasilkan spore jantan dan spore betina. Okay, so you can see the betina and the jantan. And once again, we're looking at Dryopteris species. So this is the most familiar shape to you. It's what most ferns look like. Okay, kalau kamu mau tengok anatomy Dryopteris species, di bawah itu adalah akar. Bahagian ini kita boleh panggil dia sebagai rachis. And then the leafy part, you can call it a frond. Okay, in the frond, you can divide it into pinna, and the smaller parts are called pinnules. Perlu hafal? Tidak perlu hafal. Just untuk pengetahuan kamu sahaja. Okay, so looking at the underside of Dryopteris species, you can see the sorus. Sorus is located on the underside of sporophylls of Dryopteris species. A sorus is a cluster of sporangia. So satu biji begini, setiap yang hitam itu adalah satu sporangium. Dalam setiap sporangium ada banyak spores. Okay, so this is what I said. If you look on the underside, you will see that they are dot. They are sometimes brown, sometimes black. They contain the spores inside. Alright, and then we're looking at the fiddleheads of the Dryopteris species. So when the frond is growing, dia bukan terus buka macam itu. Bila pakis-pakis fern dia tumbuh, dia daun yang muda itu akan melengkung macam ini. So it will start as a fiddlehead, a curled up leaf, a curled up frond. And the fiddlehead is called a fiddlehead because it looks like the head of a fiddle. A fiddle is a musical instrument that looks kind of like a violin but not really a violin. And if you look at the end, nampak macam sama macam kepala pakupakis yang masih muda itu. So that's why it's called fiddlehead. And you can use the word fiddlehead to describe most ferns that you see. Okay, so as you have noticed, you may have noticed this. I showed you the structure, the anatomy of several species in pteridophytes, and they can look a bit different from each other. Kalau kamu perasan tadi, Selaginella dengan Lycopodium, dia macam jauh berbeza dengan Dryopteris. And that's actually how we classify them into two phylum in pteridophytes. The first phylum is phylum Lycophyta, ataupun kalau ada buku teks yang lama, dia akan tulis Lycopodiophyta, which is also called club moss. And examples are Lycopodium species and Selaginella species. The second phylum is what we usually associate with ferns, which is phylum Pteridophyta. An example of organism in phylum Pteridophyta is Dryopteris species. Sila ambil perhatian sini, kalau dia adalah group, kita tulis dia Pteridophytes. Kalau Pteridophyta, itu sudah level phylum. So, ambil perhatian bila kamu buat spelling. This, according to our syllabus, we are still teaching you about group pteridophytes, but you may find that in some books or some sources, they don't teach about group pteridophytes anymore. Disebabkan kita sudah tahu phylum Lycophyta dengan phylum Pteridophyta, dia actually adalah dua keturunan yang berbeza. Kita kasih grup dia dalam satu grup Pteridophytes sebab dia ada beberapa ciri yang dia they have in common, okay? Yang dia ada persamaan dari beberapa aspek. Tapi ada juga saintis yang berpendapat bahawa tidak payahlah kita kira dia sebagai satu grup yang sama. Ada saintis yang dia lebih suka untuk pisahkan terus. Kalau dia mau ajar pasal Lycophyta, dia ajar Lycophyta sahaja. Kalau dia mau ajar Pteridophyta, dia akan ajar Pteridophyta saja. Dia tidak akan grupkan sekali. Tapi untuk syllabus kamu, kita grupkan sekali. Main takeaway from what I said just now is that in your syllabus, you need to know group Pteridophytes is classified into two small phylum, which is phylum Lycophyta and phylum Pteridophyta. Asalkan kamu tahu dia ada dua phylum, okay, sudah. Yang lain tidak hafal, tidak ingat, pun tidak apa. Okay, so that is me talking about that. I'm just going to move on with the diagrams. Okay, so as you can see here, this is Lycopodium species. Ini adalah gambar Lycopodium species. Kamu nampak bentuk dia ni, very cantik, very cantik. That is the sporophylls. Okay. The strobilus and inside is the sporophylls, sorry. And then this is the dominant sporophyte generation. This is Selaginella species. The dominant sporophyte generation of Selaginella species. Very nice, very pretty, very elegant looking. And this is the dominant sporophyte generation of Dryopteris species. So kita boleh tengok ada beberapa persamaan dia, tapi boleh nampak juga ada jauh perbezaan dari segi dia punya anatomy. Itulah ada saintis yang berpendapat memang perlu pisahkan. Okay, so that is it. Of course, you can compare between these two phyla. If you want to compare, you can try to compare like I did in this diagram. You can compare the leaves. You can compare the sporangium. You can compare the shape of the gametophytes. And of course, they have some similarities, especially in the form of their gametophyte will have Enteridia and Artigonia. And most importantly, both of these phylum still require water for fertilization. Okay, so itu sajalah. Yang penting kamu tahu ada dua phylum. Mau compare, mau ingat, mau hafal, up to you. So with that being said, I'll just give you a very quick summary of this subtopic. What you need to remember is that plants in group pteridophytes will have their unique characteristics. Try to memorize the unique characteristics. And you need to remember that there are two phylum in group bryophytes. Bryophytes. In group Pteridophytes. Hold on. There are 2 phyla in group Pteridophytes, and the 2 phylum are phylum Lycophyta and phylum Pteridophyta. So that is it for this very short subtopic. What should you do now? Come up with your own notes, and then you can move on to the next video lesson. That's it for me. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you, and bye!